evening, everybody. My name's Angus Kennedy, Head of External Relations at the Institute of Ideas, and welcome to tonight's meeting. Will the EU be the death of democracy? And, of course, today the background to this is the Irish referendum. People are voting on the Fiscal Pact at the moment, that treaty on stability, coordination and governance in the Economic and Monetary Union, to give it its proper name, at which the Irish people are being given a choice between binding themselves to austerity, quite possibly in perpetuity, or denying themselves access to further European Stability Mechanism bailout funds, which is something of a choice. And then there's Spain, which is itself now on the brink of either a banking collapse, 23 billion euro hole in bankiers' accounts, or at the bottom of a mountain of sovereign debt, if the European Commission and Mario Draghi of the ECB have their way. And then there's Greece. So quite possibly we should stop having public meetings about the EU and stay at home and see what happens. Actually, the idea of having these sort of public meetings, public consultations, if you like, but in a good way, came to us at a meeting last summer in Vienna of a group of European-wide debating centres. And out of that meeting came an idea for having a network, which now exists, called the European Network of Houses for Debate, Time to Talk, with the support of the Open Society Institute, is putting on a series of discussions called The Crisis in Europe, of which this is actually the first one, proud to say. And we're also very glad to be back at Goodenough College tonight, where we've had a number of events in the past, and we're very delighted that Andrew Ritchie and Roger Llewellyn were willing to be associated with us once again. So thank them very much for letting us be here. And now, before I introduce our speakers tonight, who are all going to kick us off with short introductions to the discussion, maybe 5 to 7 minutes each, just a few more words on the focus of tonight. The title is, Will the EU be the death of democracy in Europe, which is maybe a slightly partisan, slightly leading question, but it's definitely a very pressing question. And I think we could agree that democracy as it presents itself in the Eurozone today is maybe not democracy as it might once have been known. It is true that you have to be a democracy to be in the EU. You also have to be the right sort of democracy, as Ukraine is finding out at the moment. But once you're in, if you manage to get in, you tend to stay there. No matter how democratic you are, how many votes you have, how many referenda you have on the EU, it's a bit of a catch-22 Hotel California kind of democracy, as Declan here on my left and the Irish voters have been well aware over the last 10 or 11, 12 years. And whatever the result in the Irish vote tonight, you can argue that it doesn't really matter. The Fiscal Pact will be going ahead. It only needs 12 out of 17 Eurozone countries to approve it. And once they do, as Angela Merkel put it, the debt breaks will be binding and valid forever. Never will you be able to change them through a parliamentary majority. The EU actually used to be based on the principle of unanimity with these kind of decisions, and a majority in any one national country could block these kind of decisions, as the Irish votes did on the Nice and Lisbon treaties when they said no. Now the EU only requires a majority to go through, and whatever any individual member state thinks of the Fiscal Pact doesn't count, which is itself a very important change in the way EU institutions, possibly not widely renowned for democratic vitality in the first place, a change in the way they operate. And so maybe no surprise that there has been quite a degree of reaction in various forms across Europe during this crisis. We only need to look at the backlash in the last Greek election, the French election, the concerns of some that extremist, populist, even nationalist reactions across Europe are growing, and hostility to the EU is deepening. To be slightly fair on this, there are people who argue completely the opposite point of view, and that what we need is more of the EU to counter national competition and the clash of interests, that the EU is the form in which we can come together, and without it, there'll be a retreat, some fear, into the politics of the 1930s even, and that democracy itself relies on the institutions of the EU. That's something we're going to debate tonight, and just really try and take the pulse of where we feel democracy is at across Europe today, and whether or not the EU is something that is stamping on its neck or keeping it alive. So, no more from me. My speakers tonight in the order that they're going to talk. First of all, just to my right here, Brian Carney. Brian's a journalist. He's a member of the Wall Street Journal's editorial board, editor of the Wall Street Journal's Europe's editorial page, and he also co-authored a book with Isaac Getz called Freedom Incorporated, which argued that owners of companies should set their workers free. So he'll be speaking for freedom in Europe, presumably. Next up, next to Brian, is Brendan O'Neill, who's the editor of Spiked Online, who's written extensively on the issue of Europe. Spiked Online takes a position of being for Europe, but very much against the EU. Brendan will be followed by Brian Denny. On my far left, he's a trade unionist. He's the convener of No to EU, Yes to Democracy. It was founded by RMT in 2009 to campaign against the Lisbon Treaty. He's also a board member of the Campaign Against Eurofederalism and writes for its paper, The Democrat. Linda Huey, my far right, will speak next. She's the economics editor at Bloomberg TV. She's a prolific tweeter, well worth following on to get all the facts and figures of what's happening in economics across the world, not just in Europe. Also the adjunct professor of economics at London Business School and a fellow at Oxford, a lawyer and author of many books. Thank you for joining us, Linda. And last but not least, fresh from voting this morning in the Irish referendum, I'm very pleased that Declan Ganley could join us. Declan's the founder and the chairman of Libertas, set up to campaign for radical changes to what they consider the undemocratic and unaccountable structures. You may notice there's something of a kind of not EU-friendly lineup on the panel here, but I think some differences will emerge, and there are different perspectives that people take. Declan's currently chairman of the board of Rivada Networks, and can we all welcome our speakers, please?
Thank you guys all for coming. You know, Angus's last remark there, in a way, I think is telling. The Wall Street Journal certainly has always considered itself to be basically a pro-European paper. I know that Declan considers himself very much pro-European, and I don't know Brendan very well, but you described him as sort of pro-Europe but anti-EU. I don't know if you think that's fair. But all of us, I think, also have our differences with how things are run. And I think the problem with democracy in Europe is perhaps best summed up by two words, and that's Europhile and Eurosceptic. First thing to note about these two words is that they're not actually opposites, right? It's like I say, did you see that girl? I think I'm in love with her. And Declan says, I don't think she exists. It's maybe a little unfair, but the debate should not be whether you are skeptical or in love, right? I mean, there's lots of ways to love, first of all, and there's tough love, and there's blind love, and lots of things in between. And the idea that you're either sort of for it or against it, with us or against us, as a certain American politician infamously once said, is, I think, very harmful to the very idea of democracy. There are two things, I think, at the core of democracy. One of them is the notion of a loyal opposition, right? In democracy, you sometimes lose and sometimes win. And if one side always wins and one side always loses, it's a poor sort of democracy. That's why most democracies have protections for minority rights and provisions to make sure that 50% plus one don't trample on the 50% minus one, and so on. And so you need a loyal opposition, and a loyal opposition cuts both ways, right? The opposition has to be loyal, but also the other side, the winners of the moment, who, as I said, hopefully are not always the winners, have to acknowledge that you can be both in the opposition and loyal. And if both sides don't sort of grant that basic premise, then you can't have very much of a democracy. This has been problematic in certain places in Europe, going back a long way. I think that the roots of the terror in France lay in the inadequacy of the notion of a loyal opposition. The second thing, I think, you need is you need to be able to reverse the victories of the other side if you come into power, right? In Britain, this is embodied in the notion that no parliament may bind its successors. And as Angus pointed out, the EU runs along somewhat different lines. Once decisions are taken, once they are approved and ratified, they are assumed in many cases to have been taken for all time. And in fact, we're seeing in Greece right now the difficulty that you run into when the population votes one way, but previous governments have agreed to go in a different way. In Greece, they refer to it as the memorandum, right? This set of agreements that was made, the bailouts were made contingent on, and they are railing against the memorandum. And who knows, it may be that New Democracy will do as well as current polling suggests, and that immediate crisis in Greece will for the moment be averted, but that will not eliminate the problem, which is that if you accept that one parliament or one government cannot bind its successors, then you have to accept that these things are open to revision. Europe, to be democratic, needs to somehow incorporate both of these concepts better, both into their discourse and into their decision-making. The Europhiles, as it were, will say that, well, decisions are all approved by the Council, and the Council is composed of governments that themselves somehow represent majorities of their states. But the more you attenuate democracy and the more you remove it from the people, the less effective it is in preserving the rights of the majorities and the minorities alike. The larger a democracy gets, the harder it is to preserve the rights of minorities and to protect the interests of the whole unit. And the EU is a pretty large territory with a lot of people and very differing views. And I think we're a really long way from the point where Southern Europe in the current constellation would feel content to be the loyal opposition to the sort of the German bloc, as it were, if we did have a parliament that was deciding these things and imposing its will more directly on the people. I think a lot of people would say, well, wait, no, I don't really want to be in the minority in a European-wide electorate. This is a point where perhaps Declan and I have some disagreement, but I think it's actually very difficult to create an effectual democracy in a place as large and diverse and populous as Europe is. But the more Europe intrudes on the day-to-day lives of its citizens, as opposed to making sort of high-level decisions that are more nuisances than real pain, as we're seeing in Greece, then the more important it is that they have some kind of legitimacy and they're seen as legitimate. You can't get that legitimacy unless you accept that both sides have a point of view. If you're stuck in a Europhile, Eurosceptic dialectic, you will never get there. It can't be no to Europe or yes to Europe. It has to be what kind of Europe, how much of it, and what are the limits. The Constitution was an attempt to impose some kind of limits and ground rules, but it was such a monstrous 500-page long document that nobody except Declan, I think, read the whole thing or attempted to understand it. I'll just close with one little anecdote, which was back when the French were voting on the Constitution, and I was speaking to a senior council official from Brussels, a German, who said, dismissively about the French vote. He said, nobody in France has read it, even though they mailed out millions of copies. If they did read it, they wouldn't understand it. If they understood it, they wouldn't like it, but they should vote for it anyway. Thank you.
Brendan.
Both of these groups of people, both Europhiles and Eurosceptics, seem keen to absolve national governments of responsibility, to absolve nation states of responsibility for political and economic chaos. The Europhile does it by kowtowing to Brussels, calling upon EU institutions to do more to save Europe. And the Eurosceptic does it by blaming the EU for almost everything that goes wrong, for treating the EU as a kind of Death Star that has sucked decency out of every inch of Europe. So the Europhile tends to have too much faith in the EU, seeing it as a solution to every problem, while the Eurosceptic tends to have too much of a blinkered dislike of the EU, seeing it as the cause of every problem. And what they share in common is a belief that responsibility lies with the EU. Both the depiction of the EU as the saviour of Europe and the depiction of the EU as the destroyer of Europe are underpinned by an instinct to say national governments are not to blame. And in answer to the question, did the EU kill democracy, I would say no, it didn't. The EU is better understood as the end product of the death of democracy in Europe, as it's a creation of national governments that had given up on the ideas of sovereignty and democracy. The EU follows the demise of a European democracy rather than instigating it. And the real driving force behind the EU over the past 40 years was the cowardice and opportunism of national governments, not the sinister ambitions of Brussels or Berlin. National political leaders who felt increasingly estranged from their own populations fashioned this post-sovereign institution that they could effectively hide in. You know, the great benefit of the EU for these cut-off governments is that it allowed them to pursue politics in an entirely insulated fashion. It allowed them to outsource political authority to an external entity. A good example of this came in the late 1990s when the British government accepted the European ruling that the age of consent for homosexuals should be reduced from 18 to 16. And that is something that the government really wanted to do anyway, but because it believed that it would be controversial, it effectively allowed Europe to make the decision on its behalf. The benefit of the EU is that it allowed governments to take action without having to bother with pesky public debate or with taking moral responsibility. And of course, the downsides to this insulated decision-making are enormous and profound, because the more that national governments insulated themselves from their publics, the more incapable they became of exercising real leadership. The more they took refuge in EU institutions, the more out of touch and irrational they became. We had an early warning of this during the Icelandic volcanic eruption in 2010, when political leaders across Europe basically went mad. They ground aeroplanes and brought the whole of Europe to a standstill. That was a direct consequence of their self-insulation and their subsequent inability to engage with reality and show leadership. And those dangers of self-insulation can be seen even more dramatically in the Euro crisis. No politician in Europe has the first clue how to deal with the Euro crisis, precisely because every politician in Europe has spent recent decades avoiding making serious decisions, avoiding taking responsibility, avoiding being leaders. The growth of the EU outlook, the growth of the idea that political leadership is too hard and technocratic decision-making is preferable, has directly worsened the Euro crisis. But where the Eurosceptics get it wrong is in their treatment of Brussels as the single-handed destroyer of democracy, as a kind of rampaging beast that is chewing up little Englanders or poor Greek people. Because the key dynamic was always national governments offering up political authority to EU institutions and disavowing their own national sovereignty. And Eurosceptics who point the finger of blame at evil Brussels are not that different from Europhiles who kind of bow down before glorious Brussels. We're now seeing the rise of a respectable form of Euroscepticism, from President Hollande in France to Syriza in Greece. Many now berate Brussels for ruining Europe. But these attacks on Brussels are also designed to get national governments off the hook. You know, when Hollande presents France as a victim of EU decisions, he's actually playing the same game as those governments which once warmly welcomed EU decisions. He's trying to avoid having his national institutions held to account for what has happened in France. And this schizophrenic attitude to the EU is best summed up in the way Angela Merkel is now treated. I'm almost starting to feel sorry for Angela Merkel, because she is depicted by some as this Hitler-style witch who has wrecked Europe. But then she is held up by others as the potential saviour of Europe, with leaders calling upon her to save the Eurozone, to save struggling nations. Even Poland now wants Germany to save it, which is a turn-up for the history books. The Polish foreign minister recently said, "I fear German inaction more than I fear German power." And that statement really sums up today's fairly infantile attitude towards Merkel and the EU. EU power is seen as dangerous, but so is EU inaction. Some see the EU as the wrecker of nations, others believe it isn't doing enough to rescue nations. You know, the way Merkel and the EU are now treated reminds me of what Homer Simpson once said about beer. He said, "Beer is the cause of and the solution to all of life's problems." But the EU is not the cause of all of Europe's problems, and it absolutely is not the solution to them. The real problem is the thing which gave rise to the EU in the first place and which still exists, which is the estrangement of national political elites from their peoples. And if we address that and fight to hold our own leaders to account, we might just challenge the crisis of leadership in Europe and put both rationality and people's interests back on the political agenda.
Brian.
I'm from No to EU, which is a campaign based within the labour and trade union movement. And as the title suggests, we're out. We want to get out of the European Union, and we support the People's Pledge, calling for a referendum. I don't think that makes me schizophrenic particularly, but I do also think that national governments are to blame. The way of understanding what the European Union is a famous Norwegian sociologist in 1974, his name escapes me, but he said the way to understand the EU is a merger of empires that was smashed on the atrocities of World War II to come together again and merge and create one new empire. And I think that's what the national governments have been doing since that time, over the last 60 years, is colluding to create a new entity where the national political classes can exist with each other under patronage, and they slowly remove themselves from the electorates in each of the countries. So I think national governments are to blame, and indeed national parties. I remember Prescott during the Maastricht debate at the Labour Party conference in Brighton. I happened to be there. And he said, "I haven't read the Maastricht Treaty, but the Labour Party says it's all right, so it's all right." And it was this willful ignorance that has been pushed through by the Euro-federalists. And I don't think it's an equal set on either side. I think that the Monnet method of imposing the European Union secretly, incrementally over 60 years is an actual fact. It's come to pass now where everyone can see what it's doing because of the situation in Greece and everywhere else. But of course, when Edward Heath took us in, it said it was nothing to do with a single currency, and he was lying. And the Federalists have lied and lied and lied during the whole project. But I think the Institute of Ideas is brave in putting on a event where there are all Eurosceptics. I think that is useful, because having a sterile debate about for and against the EU, we are actually beyond that, and I think we should be looking at what is the problem. And people all talk about the democratic deficit within the European Union. I don't think there is one, because there was never meant to be one, because it was designed to be thoroughly undemocratic, the antithesis of democracy. And I think that's the key that we've got to unlock there, is understanding the nature of democracy and the nature of the European Union. And from a trade union perspective, in the RMT and then within No to EU, we are making ground in people rediscovering their roots of what democracy is. And ultimately, it's the ability to remove those that govern you and force them to carry out decisions on our behalf. And that's obviously what's been removed slowly over the last 60 years. As such, democracy is very, very subversive, and the rich and powerful do not like it one little bit, and they never have. And they've always sought to remove what was gained over hundreds of years. Democracy in this country is less than 100 years old, and it came about only after centuries of trade union and labour movement struggle, and then later the suffragettes. And that's almost in living memory. Democracy emerged because of the emergence of the nation state at the same time, because democracy can only exist within a nation state. It can't exist beyond the nation state because there's no commonality of understanding language and other issues. And the concept of self-determination and sovereignty is ideas of the Enlightenment, anti-colonial movements, the independence of India, Vietnam, Cuba, Ireland, the list goes on. There's no idea that those movements are suddenly abating. The postmodernists would tell us that the nation-state is out of date. Well, it certainly isn't. What the globalisation has told them is that the nation-state can't have any power, and that's just not true. If the Greece ruling class, whoever becomes the ruling class, took decisions to defend their people, there's not much else that the European bankers can do about it. And I think that strikes at the essence of what democracy can do. And it's why the European Union is actually against it as a founding principle, is against self-determination, it is against sovereignty, and it is actually formally against democracy as a concept. There is no formal democracy within EU institutions, and there never has been. The European Parliament is a consultative body which does not make law. It is not a parliament by any stretch of the imagination. Law is made by the European Commission, which is the government. It's totally unelected. And the Council of Executives meet just to rubber stamp what the Commission is telling them to do. Most of the treaties are impenetrable texts written by corporate lobby groups like the European Roundtable of Industrialists, and they become the biblical texts, in which Thomas Paine would say the dead rule the living, and it goes back to the ideas of freedom and liberty against tyranny. And it also goes back to the idea of what the European Union wants to do, and it wants to roll back democracy not just from the gains of the Second World War, it wants to roll back the gains of the French Revolution, the whole concept of self-determination. To roll back the English Revolution even, and go back to pre-democratic medieval ideas of how democracy has no part in that. And I think that's a really fundamental issue to understand. And trade unionists in this country are fundamentally relearning those lessons. What the European Union is doing is basically what the European banks are doing, which is structural adjustment for Europe, which is to remove public services, to remove all the gains made since the Second World War, and to create a corporate free-fire zone in which the banks make the money. And the reason that the bailouts of Greece and Ireland took place is in order to transfer money directly to the German and French banks that owns all the debt. And it's just that merry-go-round that increasingly is becoming obvious to most people. So we're moving into pre-democratic ideas where texts and popes and barons become the rulers, and we don't really know who they are. It could be Barroso, it could be the European Council of Ministers, but there's no accountability at all. And so what No2EU is campaigning for is to have a referendum for those issues to be discussed, because most people understand it on that level. They don't want to get into big economic debates about the nature of the crisis of capitalism. They don't necessarily understand that, but they know they want self-determination and they want to rule themselves. And the EU stands square against that. It is the regional part of globalisation, and people don't want it.
Linda, a Europhile or Eurosceptic?
I think, like a lot of economists, I'm both, which is why economists really annoy normal people. So the answer that I was going to give to the title of the debate, which is, will the EU kill democracy or be the death of democracy? I would actually say the answer is both yes and no. Oh, well, that was a good start. And the way I'm going to set out, I think, just a couple of reasons behind why I say it is actually both. And I'm going to focus a bit on the Eurozone itself. And for those of you thinking, well, that must surely be the death of democracy, I'm actually going to say that the Euro crisis could actually end up strengthening democracy within the Eurozone. And you get a hint of it from Chancellor Angela Merkel. She actually says the solution for Europe is more Europe. And there was a big interview and profile done in the New York Times of her finance minister, Wolfgang Schäuble. And in that article, he was described as the last European. And he was at the helm. He's at the helm now, but he was involved in the process and when they first started to construct the euro, the single currency. And he outlined what the intention was at the time, which was, in his view, to have a monetary union that then became a fiscal union and then became a political union and would eventually lead to a directly elected president of Europe. So a federal Europe for those countries which use the single currency. And it fits along the lines of the European project or experiment, however you want to call it, has its roots even beyond the Eurozone, but the entire EU construct came from a political will at the end of World War II to create such a construct. So for the last European, the aim of where the Eurozone reforms are headed is eventually to have a directly elected European president, and that would transform the Eurozone into a version, perhaps, of the federal United States. And in that sense, it becomes perhaps more democratic than where we are today. Of course, to get from here to there could take a few steps, and I usually have a very simple litmus test for this, which is if you asked an American where they were from, they would say America, and then they would tell you what state they were from. If you asked a European, I could do it in this room, but I'd be very surprised if many people here said they were European. You would tell me you were from Greece or Britain or Italy or wherever. And I think until being European is your first answer, the people have a long way to go before we're down that political road. Okay, now for the other side of the argument, where I do think there are problems in terms of democracy and the EU, is the way in which this particular crisis has actually shown how democratically elected leaders can't seem to serve the role that they're supposed to, which is to be the representative of the will of the people. And of course, the reason we don't live in a country where no European country runs on the basis of direct referendums is because our elected representatives are supposed to be representing our will and protecting the rights of minorities. But if you look at what's happened during this Euro crisis and during the global recession, very few European leaders have been able to explain, persuade, lead their people through the tough austerity measures to make them believe that this is warranted. And this is why you've had the fall of many governments, both inside and outside of the Eurozone, because they haven't been able to do what, say, the Canadians did in the 1990s, which is to really show that through consultation that the path the government was taking towards austerity, growth, reforms, whatever the agenda is, has the buy-in of the people. And I think in that sense, this downturn and recession has made me quite worried in terms of this process, the inability of the politicians to do what they were elected to do. And this is why you have the rise of the technocrats, technocratic governments taking over in places like Italy, for instance, and in Greece. And I think, to me, that's a very worrying development. The phrase that I always remember when I think about this, it was told to me by an aide to Herman Van Rompuy, the European Council president. Already your expectations are really low, what I'm about to say next. But actually, it's pretty well put. He said, essentially, European leaders suffer from what's called Juncker's curse. So Jean-Claude Juncker, Luxembourg prime minister, who's now become the face of the Euro crisis because he heads the Eurogroup of finance ministers. And what he actually said was, allegedly, European leaders know how to resolve the crisis. They just can't work out how to get reelected afterwards. So I think this kind of goes to my point about somehow they're not able to bring the people along. Of course, I have some doubts as to whether or not they actually know how to resolve the crisis as well. But apparently this observation was made when they looked around the table, and over the last 2.5 years, half of the leaders are different than who they were 2.5 years ago. So let me just wrap up by saying that the reason I gave both sides of the argument is it's not just because I'm an economist, but also because I don't necessarily think that there is an endpoint called democracy. I view it more as a journey. And in fact, I can't remember who actually said this, is that democracy is not the endpoint, it's the process. And it's the process that matters, and it's the process that worries me about what's happening in terms of Europe. Although I think my way of thinking about democracy in the EU recently is that it's sort of, okay, maybe this is more apropos for the Euro crisis, which is I sort of think it'll be all right, but I do wonder if it's the triumph of hope over experience. That's how people describe marriage, isn't it? Thank you very much.
And Declan, your thoughts?
You know, it was funny when you were talking about Americans, and I know what you mean, but I always think the contrarian position when I hear one, and I remembered years ago, I was sitting beside this guy on a flight back from New York to London, and he was very entertaining. His name was Joey something or other, and we were chatting and walking down to immigration, and we came up to the immigration officer, and this guy Joey was sort of fishing around for his passport, and the immigration officer said, well, what nationality are you? He said, I'm Italian. And the guy pulls out his passport and he said, but that's an American passport. Oh, yeah, I'm American, but I'm and it was the experience of the New Yorker, sort of second or third generation immigrant who had this multiplicity of identities, that he was out of the US and arriving in London and bringing this. And it's the process of becoming a European or self-identifying as a European is a long one. But I'll put it this way. If you were to take my grandfather and anybody else's grandfather from across Europe and put them together, there were a lot of things they wouldn't have in common with each other. If you were to take my two great-granduncles who were killed in the Somme and my children's great-grandfather who served in the Austrian army in the First World War, they would have been shooting at each other. You take the average European from across Europe that's below 50 or below 40 or below 30, and there's more and more things, more and more ties that bind. In the information age, in the age of social media and Facebook and Twitter and everything else, you can even see right now, even language barriers getting broken down, a way of identifying with each other that is, I think, very powerful, and it's something that's out of the control of the body politic. It's just happening. It's information, it's the exchange of information, ideas that are no longer the domain of, or the exclusive domain of the institutions that used to, if you like, be the conduits for the flow of those things. But let me get very current and talk about Ireland and where we are right now. I'll put my cards on the table. I'm a European federalist. I was born in this country, in Watford, to Irish parents. I was brought up like that guy Joey, who said he was Italian to the immigration officer. I always said I was Irish. And we eventually moved back to Ireland. And I built businesses across Europe and now in the United States as well. And I'm very comfortable self-identifying as European. My wife is half Polish, half Italian descent, New Yorker, American. And I look at Europe, and I've got a picture in my dining room, a portrait of my children's great-grandfather in his Austrian army uniform, and I have pictures of my two great-uncles that were killed in the Somme in one of the Irish regiments of the British Army. And I think about how far we've come in Europe, and I think to assume that we couldn't fall back to that place again is too big of an assumption, in spite of all of the things that I've just said about barriers coming down. I don't think that peace, security, prosperity is guaranteed at all. I think you have to keep working on it. It's a process, and it's a hard one, and it takes really hard work. The single biggest achievement of the European project since the end of the Second World War is that it has, by and large, managed to secure the peace, first and foremost. And that is a phenomenal achievement. And it's worth all of the bad things that came with it, all of the things that we don't like, have been worth it up to now to have met that achievement. It's really, really good that my generation is not going to have to dress up in uniforms and go out and meet other guys from my generation and start shooting at each other across some battlefield in Europe like my great-uncles did and my children's great-grandfather did. So let's give score one for Europe on that note. And it's a really big one, and it takes a lot to offset that. But some things are worth fighting for. And in the past, there were generations who thought some things were worth dying for. And what are those things? The right to freedom, the right to self-determination, dignity, security, all of those things. And to Brian's point when he opened up, what the Europe that I have been battling for the last number of years, it's becoming Jacobin. I am very worried that the Europe that we are heading toward is a Europe that is more a Europe of Robespierre than it is a Europe of Edmund Burke. And the concept of quiet government, the concept of individual freedom, of real liberty, is slowly being suffocated. It's not even deliberate. It's just kind of, sort of happening. Sovereignty, the sovereignty of the individual, and more power is being passed to institutions in the center and away from the citizen. And my understanding of democracy, being the simple Irishman that I am, is as such. I have power, we all have. We lend it to a politician via a ballot box. It's a loan. And that politician exercises our power, our authority, our mandate on our behalf. And if we don't like what they're doing with it, the most important thing about democracy is that we can take it off them and give it to somebody else. Or spoil our vote, or whatever it is, but that our vote really matters because it is our power that we're delegating. Now, what has happened is, and to a point that's been made earlier, is that power, over time, has been transferred by those politicians to entities at a European level. It has been pooled, it has been collectivized, and is exercised by people that don't have to check in with me or any of you at a ballot box once in a while. So we can't vote the buggers out. We can't do it any longer. And then you look at the construct like the ESM, which is supposedly going to be funded to the tune of some 700 billion at the outset. And you read Article 32 and Article 35, and this is an entity that literally sets itself above the law. It is an outlaw institution because it is not subject to any juridical process anywhere. You'll never see anybody being taken out in handcuffs, not that I'm ever suggesting, but it could never happen because no police force could ever go into those offices. No equivalent of an investigator of any kind can investigate it from anywhere. Now, if we are comfortable in Europe with creating institutions that are outside of the law, then we are no longer, if you want to call Europe a country, because it has, but whatever it is, as a superstate, but we are not a country of laws, because it is outside and beyond the law. It's not accountable to anybody. Now, I could spend the next several days here boring you to tears, detailing point by point the flaws and the disconnect that has been ever widening in European institutions between democratic accountability, between the citizens and those that are governing them and making their laws and regulations. But let me cut to the chase and say that we have to dramatically reform this now. And we have to do something that's going to sort of shock the system, that is going to have Europe expose its inner workings, its entrails, if you like, to the light of day, so that people can understand how it operates, what it works, and that we have to create competition, a competition of big ideas, and we need to do that now. We need to have the competition of ideas so that people are out there competing in a democratic process, so that there is a touchstone that is European that can pull people together. And this comes back to this point about an elected European president. And some people, even beside me, may fall over hearing me saying this, but I've actually been saying this for a long time. And that is to say, if you look at all of the institutions, you look at all of the bodies in Europe, we need to catalyze this scrap, this debate. And the institution to do that with is by combining the presidency of the Commission and the Council and making that position open to competition and to election. And to have that office be open to a presidential election, I would say preferably before the end or by the end of next year. Now, what would happen in such a situation? Let's just go work with me here for a second, okay? Let's say that you did that. What would happen? Well, you'll have a number of people throw their hat in the ring for that competition. Nicolas Sarkozy, Tony Blair, other names, some of which you've heard, some of which you may not have heard or may not be that familiar. But what these guys are going to understand and learn very quickly is that you will not gain election to that office by pandering to olive growers in Sicily or to beef farmers in the west of Ireland or to metal workers in the Ruhr Valley. You're going to have to actually produce serious ideas, and you're going to face competition for those ideas, because the grand myopia that is afflicting Europe right now, the groupthink that you see in the European Parliament as it currently exists, that would be broken by the competition of ideas. Now, to do that, you have to remove the power of initiation from the Commission. It should not be able to legislate. It should not be able to initiate regulation. You need to create a European Senate. You need to balance the European Parliament properly so that the member states, it better reflects population, so it's fairer to the large countries, but you balance out the interests of the smaller countries in the creation of a European Senate where every state has an equal number of seats. And that way, if you like, you force the debate and you force accountability of sorts. Now, before you can do any of that stuff, the cancer that is eating away at the European project right now is that of insolvency. You have to deal with that first. And we have to embrace the idea of bankruptcy again in Europe, that we allow the freedom to fail for financial institutions that cannot continue. We cannot transfer pre-failed risk to taxpayers after it's failed. Taxpayers aren't patsies that pick up the bill for somebody's horse that dropped dead at Beecher's Brook or whatever it is. That's not what they're for. And that's what's being done right now. And it's being done because the idea is let's keep these financial institutions going because they'll show up at our next bond auction and they won't charge us maybe the prices that they should be charging us to provide capital to us. Well, tough. That's the way it goes. I'll wrap up. So bankruptcy and an insolvency purge is a prerequisite to any of this other stuff working. It happens to be particularly acute in Ireland because we have a bigger share of this failed bank debt than any other group of citizens in Europe. And we need to shock the system in Europe to create political competition, to create elected offices that will expose the workings of this operation in the cold light of day and foster a competition of big ideas.
Right, there's been a lot of ranges of views, which I'm going to just explore one aspect of. Brian, you started us off, I think, with a very good question, which is what kind of Europe do we want to live in? And Brendan was arguing that the EU institutions represent something of a bomb shelter for national elites who have lost, in the darkness of that shelter, the ability to make decisions and address the problems at home. And Brian, Denny, you're arguing that the EU itself is a sort of imperial superstate, denying the only democratic bodies we have, which are those of national sovereignty. And Linda is saying that maybe we could get to a post-sovereign federal Europe if nations had a way of coming together, but in the current inability to answer the problems of the crisis, the solution by default seems to lead us at a national level to technocracy, to Monti in Italy. There's no government in Holland. There isn't one in Greece currently. And so on that level, Declan is clearly right that there needs to be a very serious competition of ideas. If you boil it down to that aspect of the problem, is national self-interest going to be the solution, or is it the problem? One thing I really struggle with trying to understand this is that you've all, in your different ways, and you're not alone in recognizing now the democratic problems with a lot of the European institutions. Lots of people, Eurosceptic or Europhile, think there's a problem. But nonetheless, at the same time, people in European countries from Ireland to Greece want to stay in the euro.
In one of the Federalist Papers, you know, it says, if men were angels, we wouldn't need government. I think if technocrats were angels, we wouldn't need democracy, right? And we have democracy because all of us, including our leaders, are fallible. They make mistakes. There are disagreements, and some of those disagreements are unreconcilable. And so one of the reasons we have accountability is precisely to take account of the errors that are inevitable in our politics. And the farther away we get from accountability, the more likely error is to persist, and the less likely we are to sort of to have the best ideas win in the marketplace of ideas. And you know, that in spirit, I totally agree with Declan that a sort of enormous political competition would bring great, you know, vigor into the debates that go on about how best to deal with austerity, deficit spending, huge debts, et cetera. In practice, I think we're a long way from, you know, even linguistically being able to have those debates across all of Europe. And Europe has always existed in that tension, and the people who support Europe have always sort of hoped they would break down the most pernicious barriers without creating that super state that so many people fear. These things are hard. I don't think there's a single perfect answer to how much Europe we could have, or at what point national interest should start to trump collective interest. If that model, right, if the technocratic EU model were perfect, we could have a one world government and everybody would be happy, but nobody wants that. The European superstate in nascence is just, you know, it's that on a slightly smaller scale, but it's not different in kind.
Okay, but Brendan, your take, I mean, if the national elites are sheltering in Brussels bomb shelters, is it not also the case that the people of various nation states want to shelter behind the EU equally? Is it realistic to expect them to get over there and get all Jacobin and roust the elites out?
I think European people are generally more cynical about the EU than elites are, because the elites, national elites, benefit directly from the European Union in the sense that it gives them a thing onto which they can project all their own failures and all their own inabilities to resolve national problems. They can say, it's the EU's fault, we have no choice, we have to do this, they've told us to do it. Or they can say, the EU has ruined our economy, the EU has done this. So it's a very useful device for them, but I think ordinary people recognize that it's not particularly useful for them. And so there is a great cynicism towards it. And that's why I think we saw the rise of a no vote over the past 10 years in various different referendums. And it was a very positive rejection of the EU from ordinary people. The problem that's happened recently over the past year or two is that no sentiment has been exploited and manipulated by politicians, particularly Hollande and Syriza and Geert Wilders and various other people who have institutionalized that no sentiment as a kind of very cynical, anti-globalization, borderline conspiracy theorist outlook for their own ends. That's the problem. And I think we need to distinguish when we talk about Europe and the EU, because these are very different things. Europe is a great thing. We all agree on that. The EU is a terrible thing. It's a coalition of elites. It's not a coalition of peoples. And that's why I disagree with Declan. I don't think it is reformable. I think it's completely unreformable, given the origins, given where it comes from and what it represents, and it needs to be done away with. Which is why I wish we did have a Europe of Robespierre, because then maybe there'd be a few revolutionaries willing to get rid of the ancient regime that that the national elites have created in the EU.
Linda, your take, and then I'll bring in Brian and Declan. Do you think there can be political, either national or federal solutions to this economic crisis, or is it just too big?
For me, there's been a very funny thing about economists through this crisis, in that economists didn't see the global crisis coming, but now they're highly in demand to explain the crisis. I sort of think of institutions around the EU in kind of the same way. So there's a feeling that there's too many of them. We don't know what they do. But now, if you look at where the Euro crisis is at, all the talk is of more EU cross-border institutions, like a fund to resolve banks, like European-wide deposit insurance, like these are the European Rescue Fund. These are the kinds of things which are emerging. And I think the way I think about it is that if the leaders haven't done enough of a job to decide, first of all, where the Eurozone or the EU is going, then they can't bring anybody along. So what you don't want is sort of institutional creep, that because some of them have this idea it's going to move down this direction, they've sort of created institutions along those lines or allowed banks to become very connected across borders so that when something goes wrong, then all of a sudden you need the institution there. To me, that process is backwards. What you should decide is where are you going? Is this simply a single market, in which case you're really just a free trade area? There's no need to have the kind of integration that the EU is clearly pushing forward on a number of fronts. However, if this really is a political project to make Europe like a federal Europe, eventually down the line, like the United States, then there has to be a very clear delineation of responsibilities, powers at the state and at the federal level. And then you have the institutions that fit that. What you shouldn't have is what we currently have now, which is the banks have gotten themselves completely intertwined. And now we need lots of European-wide institutions to resolve cross-border systematically important banks. That's going to be another power that's going to be given to the Europeans, which I don't think carries with it the kind of democratic legitimacy that's needed for these institutions to retain their their rightful existence in the future. So for me, there is a political decision that needs to be made, and then the economists can be brought in and write the models to try and make it happen.
Declan, do you want to come back on maybe on Brendan's point? Can you turn popular cynicism into hope?
I haven't heard a better plan. So, and it's a hell of a lot better than anything else that's being suggested right now, which has all amounted to a hill of beans. The summitry that we've seen take place over the last year and a half has only compounded the problem. The idea is still being pursued that we should risk the whole the euro and the European project to save a bunch of flailing financial institutions that should just be allowed to go through the bankruptcy process. It's old-fashioned, but it works. And yes, it does cause a bit of pain, and some politicians might lose their jobs and get voted out, but tough. I mean, let the bankruptcy process do its work. If there was any treaty that Europe needed immediately, that Ireland needed immediately today to sign up to, and a law that I would agree to be, love to see being brought in on a pan-European level, it would be a liberalisation of bankruptcy laws across the European Union so that these financial institutions could be allowed to go through the insolvency purge, because unless we do that, the whole of insolvency, I am very concerned, is going to keep getting deeper. This is a sinkhole. Nobody knows how big it is. Nobody knows what the real book value of the Spanish banking system is. Nobody knows if that apartment in wherever that nobody's going to buy for the next 20 years is worth €1. Maybe it should be knocked down. If nobody's ever going to buy it, it's worth nothing right now. And the interconnectivity of all of these banks is such that it's a real big problem for them. The only way we're going to find out where we really stand in terms of what is solvent and what is not is by having a bankruptcy purge. And then people will pay something for those loan books, and maybe it's going to be 10 cents on the euro, maybe it will be 90 cents on the euro, I don't know. But you have to do it, because then we find the bottom, and then you can have recovery. But of course, if you're going to do that, there are a number of other things that you have to do. You have to allow for a change of conditions so that you remove the red tape that exists there for small and medium-sized enterprises that want to go out and hire more people. The place that growth is going to come from, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure this out. Look across Europe and look at where do 80% of all new jobs get created? in the small and medium-sized enterprise sector, small businesses, start-up businesses, etc. That's where new jobs get created. That's where they're going to come from. That insolvency purge is what is essential for that kind of growth to return.
Brian, will the free market sort it out?
I think the problem is really the EU structures themselves. You know, Declan talked about war in Europe. I mean, it's an interesting case study. In the negotiations of the 1992 Maastricht Treaty, John Major tried to get an opt-out in the single currency. Germany said, you can have your opt-out, but you must recognise Croatia, which led to the biggest war in the Balkans since World War II. So the EU created that war because of the horse trading that goes on within the power structures of the European Union. And I think that's what's going on now. There's this paralysis because no one knows what to do, and the EU is being used by Germany to basically become a colonial overlord of the rest of Europe, and at the moment it's Greece. And the Greeks understand this. I mean, they've made it clear what they think of German dominance of Greece. And what the EU has actually done, slowly after the last 20 years, is reverse the results of World War II, in which the big colonial powers before the war have now got all the powers back. And that doesn't lead to a solution of the crisis we're in. The German banks, it wasn't the Anglo-Saxon model that created the crisis in Greece. It was the German banks desperate to get rid of their export capital, pouring it into Greece, and then sparking the crisis. And now they want their money back, and they're using the European Union to do that. So the European Union cannot solve this crisis. And what would solve the crisis more would be the reintroduction of democracy, in which Greece could get the drachma back. We could all go on holiday there, and they might get some sort of pay rise. But why in the austerity, permanent austerity they've got, is permanent low pay, and that's what they're going to get in Ireland as well. It's not a question: do you support this austerity package? Do you support permanent poverty, And then the peoples of Europe are saying no, and the EU is desperate to stop those voices being heard. And after the Syriza government, it won't be able to form a government in Greece, it won't get enough votes. But they are fostering the illusion that somehow you can stay within the Eurozone and have an expansionist policy, which is absolutely madness, because you can't. And I think that we're coming to that wall where the structures of the European Union are just not fit for purpose.
Okay, lots to talk about. I'm going to take a range of points.
I want to just strongly disagree with one thing Declan said, although I agreed with many of the other things he said. And this is going to sound a bit strange, but the idea that the best thing about the EU is that it stopped and repeated the Second World War, that in fact is the worst thing about the EU. And that in fact is that the way of understanding the root of all the problems, the undemocratic character of the EU. And I don't say that because I want another war, and I don't think the EU has stopped the war in any case. I think it's because the whole European Union is based on the principle of order, of keeping stability. That's what it does above everything else. So it's not just that it has undemocratic institutions, although it certainly does, but the whole purpose of it is to keep this kind of stability. All the rules, all the institutions are built on that. And you can see that, just very briefly, originating in Germany for obvious historical reasons. I mean, they had, excuse my pronunciation, but Ordnungspolitik, the whole German post-war politics, was based on we need rules, we need institutions, we need to minimize democracy. And then the EU has been built in that image. I mean, you can see it in relation to economic policy, for example, where they have all these rules, Stability and Growth Pact, Fiscal Compact, other kind of institutions, which shows that at its root, it's a completely undemocratic, technocratic institution. And it is because it's based on order at the very root. It's not at all a democratic institution in any sense at all.
So I'd just like to make three very brief points. Linda and Declan raised the prospect of an EU presidency, an elected presidency, which they implied would somehow make the European democratic. Well, I mean, even if this were to happen, which it won't, that wouldn't make the European democratic unless the peoples of Europe consent to give federal-level institutions their allegiance. And that can only happen if you have referendums in the member countries, and the French or the British or the Maltese or whatever say, we are primarily not Maltese or French, we are primarily European, going back to Linda's point. So even if the institutions were democratic, the way that this process of unification has been taking place is certainly undemocratic. It's as if Britain was suddenly to be incorporated into the United States of America. You might say the institutions of that new union would be democratic, but it would not be democratic for the British people who were taken into a new political union in which they had 1% of the votes. So let's put that to bed. Secondly, let's look at the future. Clearly, Europe is a declining part of the world. By 2020, it will account for something like 15% of world GDP, and it will continue to decline. And I think future generations of Europeans will see this bizarre obsession with the European Union as very odd in a few years' time, because I think the peoples of Europe, and certainly the younger peoples of this country, they will be looking for their government and their institutions to make better alliances and to establish better trading relationships with, in fact, countries outside of Europe. So we need to be less little European in our mindset. The last point really follows on from the point this gentleman was making. But I think it's absolutely fundamental to understand that the Second World War was nothing to do with the existence of nation states. In fact, the Second World War was the product of pan-Europeanism I, the first attempt by the fascists to create a unified Europe. And it was the fight back by free nations and national liberation movements within countries that resulted in the peace we have benefited from. So in fact, Europeanization leads to war, political instability.
What I would like to know, like Declan pointed out, is what are the solutions? What do you suggest? We know that we have leadership problem. We know that democracy is being damaged. We know that the austerity issue is killing people. But what do you suggest? Please tell us.
Two questions. The first to Declan and the second to Brendan and Brian. The first one is trying to understand your thought, Declan. It's like Princess Anne and Prince Charles saying, okay, let's have a competition of ideas. Why would they bother? And my question to you, Brian and Brendan, is how do you differ from any UKIP political position?
On the question about where I differ from UKIP on these issues, I think I differ not only from UKIP but also from the left-wing opposition to the EU, because what I think the right and the left opponents of the EU have in common is this rather shallow kind of anti-globalization, panic about outsiders, this idea that we're under attack from American banks or American credit rating agencies or Chinese goods or Brussels diktat, that slightly crazy, obsessive outlook that they have. And you could really see that in the French presidential elections when there was very little difference between Marine Le Pen and Mélenchon, the radical left-wing candidate for president, both of whom talked endlessly about the evil EU and globalization and the way in which France was being invaded and diluted and transformed by these external forces. I see the EU not as this kind of external evil entity that threatens civilization, and certainly not as a kind of German colonial overlord, but as the creation of our own governments conning us and outsourcing authority away from our nations and away from the people to an external institution. That's the problem.
Well, yeah, but Brendan, that's what I said as well. I mean, I agree with you. That's what I said. The thing about UKIP, they like to pander up to the idea of it's a foreign plot and all that. It's not a foreign plot. It's a plot of political elites coming together. And Brendan, I think we agree with each other. So I don't know if it's this idea of I'm crazy or whatever, but I mean, I think we both agree that this is a general malaise of politics in Europe.
But you did talk about the German colonial
Well,
overlord.
if you look at the history of what's going on in terms of Germany's doing very well out of the situation. They're not in crisis. They've got money to get rid of. I mean, they've done very well out of it, and that's an objective reality. That's not me saying a conspiracy theory. If you look at the economic data, the only reason that there's growth in Europe is because there's one country in Europe that has got growth, and it's called Germany. That's an objective fact. That's not me saying that being David Icke. But I would say the difference between UKIP and No to EU, for instance, is that basically Nigel Farage is a Tory party in exile who represents the finance sector, and he wants to defend the finance sector. No to EU, however, I actually debated with him on the politics show about this, and I said, will you renationalise the railways and rescind EU directives that smashed up our railways in 1996. He goes, no, I agree with those. I agree with the privatisation. So he agrees with EU directives because they're basically neoliberal, and that's the contradiction with UKIP.
The point about having a European president to be democratically elected, I don't see how they might be elected by a vote, but they couldn't be democratically elected until a demos existed to elect them, and there isn't one. On that thought, and somewhat sort of futuristically, I guess the one way you might get a Europe rather than an EU is that the EU is so completely awful for so many people across Europe that there is something that unites the people of Europe, and that is the fact that the EU is incapable of providing them with what they need.
A couple of themes that really struck a chord with me. One was Declan's call for a contestation of ideas, which poses the question, what should we be contesting at the moment? And Brendan's view, the use of the European institutions by national elites to evade responsibility. And it seems to me there's a way we can bring those two themes together in a forward-looking way. Because I think striking us in the face, obviously, is what Declan calls insolvency, but what is the Eurozone crisis? And it seems to me that could be the device around which the contestation of ideas should take place. Shouldn't we get rid of this institution? Because on the question of the evasion of national responsibility, that really is what the Eurozone has been about since its creation. It's been, writ large, a means by which the national elites have evaded responsibility for not just the democracy of their countries, but for the prosperity of their countries. It's been a means, and I would say this applies equally to the elites of the so-called stronger economies like Germany, commenting on what you were saying here, as it has been used by the elites of the weaker economies as well. I don't take this view that Germany is strong and Greece is weak. Both have seen a situation where they've exploited the Eurozone. The Germans by taking advantage of an undervalued currency to export to effectively a captive market. So they have avoided dealing with their own question of national economic atrophy, while on the weaker economy side, they have obviously taken advantage of the cheap capital flows, similarly to avoid taking responsibility. So if one had a contestation of ideas around getting rid of the euro, that would, in a sense, clear the grounds to actually force the national elites to take some responsibility for the peace and prosperity and democracy of their peoples.
Brian Carney, you said if technocrats were angels, we wouldn't need democracy. And I'm sure you didn't mean that, really. Because even if technocrats were angels, I don't want to be ruled by angels. I want to rule our rulers. I mean, they're acting at my bidding. And so I think that there is a danger. I mean, the truth of the matter is that often technocrats are more efficient than democrats. You can actually imagine authoritarian regimes pulling certain things off and more efficiently than a lot of democratic regimes. But I don't support a regime just because it's efficient and gets the trains to run on time. So I'm concerned to kind of raise that. Brian and I, as you'll know, Brian, we were both at a dinner a couple of weeks ago, actually a dinner of Europhiles who were actually saying we have a democratic deficit problem and we have to create a European demos. And some of the things that have been said tonight, that's what they were saying. They might have been saying it to save their own skins, but that was what they were saying. How are we going to create a demos? We have no legitimacy unless we've got a popular mandate. We haven't got a popular mandate, what can we do? And you could suddenly see that the people and democracy was being kind of brought on as a stage army in a way. And I suppose my problem is how not to sound similar to that, because I want to say I'm on the side of the people and I want a European demos, I want a national demos and all the rest of it. But I'm also aware of the fact that it's a rather faded version of the democratic demos that we have. You know, hardly anyone voted in Ireland today, it would appear in the referendum.
Which means my side's probably going to win.
Yeah, that, and therefore you could rejoice, but actually you'd be depressed. One of the problems I've got is that all the people who were voting no to give the EU a bloody nose, but it wasn't an actual kind of I've got every sympathy with them, but it wasn't a kind of absolute, I am making a democratic decision. It was a kind of tired, cynical, irritated, furious, frustrated, everything I sympathise with. But it wasn't the same kind of active democratic engagement that we might all want. And I suppose that finally gets me to the other, Brian, which is when you were saying EU, I agreed with most of what you said, but when you were saying EU directives that are neoliberal are the problem, I mean, one of my frustrations is when I was involved in trade union politics was the number of trade unionists who hid behind EU directives.
Tell me about it.
Not on the neoliberal questions, but forever saying, you know, we shouldn't be treated like this by the bosses because the EU says we hiding behind the protection, go into the EU. So the truth of the matter is that it's the home democratic deficit that I'm worried about, and I actually don't think you can blame the EU for that. So we've got to be careful we don't just end up EU bashing and abdicating responsibility for our own job.
Brian here made the point about the drachma and going on holiday. And we're in a situation, I went to Greece recently, people are desperate for something to change, something positive to come out of it. But when you look realistically in Greece, both the pro and anti-bailout parties do not seem to offer anything different or any serious getting to grips with the situation. Certainly no opposition to the euro, but in reality, some of the suggestions made by a colleague a bit further forward, such as, obviously you need maybe to have an orderly breakup of the euro or something like that, which is quite a big thing to do, but it's not impossible. Having a devaluation of currency, in theory, is not impossible, or a default, and you know, Declan's point, which I agreed with in the introduction, of a freedom to fail, I mean, in the past wasn't a particularly controversial idea, whereas now you have to kind of support anything, even if it's completely bankrupt. So some of the solutions to the problems don't seem that impossible, or certainly things that could move things forward, even though there does seem to be an impasse. But there obviously is a problem, as Brendan says, and you can't quite see where the impetus is going to come forward. But having said that, I would say on the positive side, firstly, there are a lot of people who are desperate for something to happen, and also there are things which are not that major which could happen, which could move things forward with a bit of will.
Claire, I don't know if you fully appreciate the can of worms you've opened, but Angus will kill me if I give a really adequate answer to that question. Whether I meant it or not is irrelevant because there are no technocratic angels, right? It was a rhetorical point. I would say, to give the question some credence, I don't think democracy is an end in itself. I think that the maximum freedom for the maximum number of people ought to be the end in itself. And a democracy can be tyrannical. And as I said, you know, I don't think a democracy has the right for the majority to willy-nilly oppress the minority. And so, self-determination, not collective determination, would be my priority. And if the technocrats were angels, they would recognize that and they'd leave us to our own devices. More broadly, I think the EU works best when it brings the people negative freedoms, right? The freedom to move around, to move their money, to move their goods, to sell their wares across the whole continent. It's the most controversial, and it does the most harm when it starts encroaching on everybody's freedoms in the name of equality.
The thing is, this is the coin of the realm now in 17 members of the Euro states, the euro. And the problem, we crossed the Rubicon setting this thing up much too early. We didn't have fiscal union. Right now you have the European interest being confused with the interests of the larger member states, Mercosi as it was called. So, for example, for a big issue for those of us on the periphery, tax competition. We have to have tax competition because we are not close to the centres of population. We're not on the main railway networks. Therefore, we need to be able to offset those disadvantages by offering attractive tax deals. Tax harmonisation across the European Union will kill places like Ireland, absolutely wipe us out. The financial transaction tax, the excuse being used that, we must make the banks pay for their mistakes with this financial transaction tax. The way you make banks pay for their mistakes is you allow them to go bankrupt. That's what you do. It's simple.
The lack of democracy that a lot of people have talked about doesn't seem to have bothered the political elite at any time during the course of the EU, including all the major parties that we've got in power in the western part of Europe. And when we got these changes to new institutions, and it was obvious that there was going to be less democracy as a result, because this is the story of the evolution of the EU,
they didn't fight against it on the basis that it was undemocratic. So I think in terms of the question, will the EU be the death of democracy, we should acknowledge that there's been a decline in democracy and that we're heading towards probably a death without it. And I'd also just like to link that finally with the point that the democracy has become less important in the eyes of the people. So the reason that people aren't voting is because of what's happening to democracy as a result of the first 2 points. And if we got more acknowledgement of that, then we've got a chance of getting more democracy. So although it's not perfect, and with Declan, we may as well get some more in the can and get some ideas that come with it, because we're in trouble at the moment.
There have been undoubtedly, in my opinion, some good things that come out of Europe, as the common market, the lowering of borders, which allows the free movement of goods and peoples. The question I'm trying to ask is, how do you keep the good bits of Europe and get rid of the undemocratic bits? I do think, in part, although I am torn on the nation-state part, I think that the nation-state was in part responsible for the First World War. However, I do take the point made up here about a lot of people who are very hostile to a nation-state do seem to have a medievalist view, whereby power is either dispersed into unaccountable local power or a supranational authority mediating between different cultures, i.e. the multiculturalist dystopia, essentially. So my question really is, how do you keep the good bits of Europe without the bad bits of the EU? Yeah.
We're running out of time. We have to deal with this insolvency issue now. The other big time bomb that's waiting to go off is that of the pension time bomb right across Europe, so we need to radically address the pensions issue now. I would say follow the Chilean model of how they reform their pension system. We need to shake this system up. We need to introduce democracy. I think the sort of X factor issue that I can pick right now is this issue of the presidency. It's not perfect, but it's the most immediate one that you can pick. You also need to create this European Senate to check balance out the interests of the small versus larger member states. We need to do that now. It might not work, but it's worth trying.
I know we focused a great deal on trying to work out whether or not this construct called the European Union is democratic in the ways that we can get there. We've heard a range of views on the panel about what needs to be done, some radical, some a little bit more laid back. But I think the larger point that I would want to make is that because of the increasingly globalized world, this notion that you need to have cross-border or supranational institutions, this is an issue everywhere. So if you want global trade, you need to have some body to resolve trade disputes that isn't based on the rule of the mighty over the rule of the weak. And so a lot of these institutions do start off, some of them, with the right mandate and perhaps operate in a way that seems acceptable. So I think those are the two realities that we have to confront. Yes, we want to have democracy. We need to have democracy. There are plenty of people in this world who would perhaps look at this debate and say, well, this is more democracy than I have. And I think we need to value that. But the other side of it is that if you do have a lot of connections, it doesn't have to be business connections, if you see how connected countries are, then the whole notion, and if there are issues which arise across borders, it raises a new set of issues. And the challenge there is, do you want institutions to resolve them, or do you end up with sovereigns trying to battle it out? The reason I use the WTO is because before the WTO, it really was very difficult for a Latin American country to stand up to the United States when they negotiated a trade issue, because the United States was their benefactor. And I think that's leveled the playing field.
Brian.
I think the internal market and the free movement of goods, services and capital and labour are going to prolong this crisis for years longer than it has to. The four freedoms are not freedoms, they're a disaster. No member state can control the flow of capital in and out. It can't control the flow of labour. It leads to chaos. The Greek government can't control capital flight. And what happens is capital has got the power to wander anywhere it can around Europe, and labour people are reduced to camp followers of capital where they've got to follow where the money goes. That is not rational. That is pre-democratic ideas. Now, what we should do is that those 4 so-called freedoms should be under democratic control of electorates. They should decide about what capital is controlled, what goods go through their country. The idea that globalisation, the free market, solves all our problems is utterly mad. And no one, by objective reality, it hasn't worked. And it's going to prolong this crisis because big capital will sit there with their money, will do nothing with it until there is some sort of democratic intervention. So I think the 4 freedoms are the fundamental part of the problem.
One problem with the warping of the no sentiment and with this kind of anti-Merkel, anti-Germany, anti-globalization outlook is that it gives rise to an anti-EU sentiment that is actually very parochial and very protectionist, and I think we've just had a glimpse of that. And you really saw that in the French presidential elections when the candidates all flitted very easily between being anti-globalization and anti-immigrant, anti-Merkel and anti-Labour flows. That kind of idea that we have to hunker down and shut ourselves off and protect ourselves, which is actually more like old-style nationalism than it is anything to do with modern-day Europe. And I think what I'm talking about when I say we need to hold our own national governments to account is not that we need to hide behind our borders and cut off all contact with the Greeks or the Irish or whoever else. But what we have in common in Europe across borders is precisely the behaviour of our governments, precisely our government's unwillingness to take responsibility and their evasion of responsibility for huge, important political and economic issues. That is the thing that binds Europeans together. And if we take on our own governments, that's the thing that also can unite us. Then finally, in relation to the contestation of ideas, one thing that I think would be worth throwing into that is there's this real interesting thing in Europe at the moment, which is that most people recognise that public expenditure needs to be trimmed and cut. But at the same time, no one believes that people can survive without the state for ideological reasons, because it's thought that people are weak and pathetic and can't exist without the state's help and the state's largesse. That's one of the real problems we have in Europe at the moment. There's really an ideological barrier to some of the economic measures that need to be taken, which is driven by European elites' lack of faith in ordinary people who are seen as individuals who need the state to do everything for them. So in terms of the contestation of ideas and how it mixes the politics and the economic, I think that's one issue that would really worth be putting on the table.
Thank you. Just a couple things. One is, I would be willing to bet whatever I've got that if you put the 4 freedoms up to a vote across Europe, that would probably be about the one thing that would survive a popular test at the ballot box. I think that Britons enjoy being able to buy German cars and French cheese and even to hire Polish baristas, and the fact that London is full of them is testament enough to that fact. And I think that the 4 freedoms are what's best about Europe, and the one thing that if everything else fell apart, I would hope that you would somehow find a way to preserve, because it would make everybody else poorer to go back on that and to raise up barriers to trade and to travel and everything else. The only other point I wanted to make was to the gentleman in the back. You're selling the UK short as the 51st state. You'd have almost 18% of the vote, I figure, and that's more say in the American government of which you would be a part than Britain offered the colonists back in the bad old days.
Can we thank our panelists?